Imagine a typical night in medieval London or Paris. The streets are plunged into total darkness, and the silence is broken only by the wind. Suddenly, someone screams desperately for help, and the sky is lit up by an eerie orange glow. This meant only one thing. A fire had broken out somewhere, and every minute counted. No one dialed the emergency number because people had to save themselves. In those days, fires could destroy entire cities in just a few hours. The wooden houses stood so close together that the flames leaped from roof to roof in an instant. It is hard for modern people to grasp the scale of this constant, daily threat. Today we are used to smoke detectors and wailing sirens outside our windows. Back then, the only warning signs were a neighbor's shout and the ringing of a church bell. But this is where things get most interesting and unexpected for us. We're used to thinking that people in the past simply ran around in a panic with buckets. In reality, they had a complex and brutal survival system. Medieval communities fought fires using methods that would seem barbaric to modern firefighters. And yet these harsh rules actually worked and saved thousands of lives. They had no pumps, hydrants, or rescue helicopters. Their arsenal consisted only of well water, hooks, and their own hands. If a house caught fire, there was practically no chance of saving it. It sounds cruel, but medieval firefighters didn't put out the burning building, they put out the neighboring structures. The goal was to stop the chain reaction at any cost, even if it meant destroying someone else's property. Modern experts call this creating fire breaks. Medieval people simply called it common sense and their only chance of survival. They developed clear protocols for action hundreds of years before the advent of fire departments. These rules were written in blood, ash, and cities burned to the ground. Your life literally depended on how quickly your neighbors would come to your aid. Try to grasp one simple thing about life in a medieval city. Fire was everywhere, in stoves, in candles, in blacksmiths' forges, and in bakers' ovens. People literally lived inside a giant powder keg, playing with sparks. Any overturned lamp or carelessly tossed coal could wipe the city off the face of the earth. That's why the fear of fire united people more strongly than the threat of war or the plague. We'll talk about how ordinary townspeople transformed into a well-coordinated army. You'll learn why wooden hooks were valued more than barrels of water. We'll examine why people were forced to go out into the streets at night and stand watch for hours on end. Today, we view fire safety as something boring, written in fine print. Back then, it was a matter of life and death that affected absolutely every resident. Modern technology has made us complacent and caused us to forget our basic instincts. Your smart home will call the emergency services on its own if it detects smoke in the kitchen. A medieval peasant would simply laugh at the helplessness of modern people. They relied solely on the strength of their own hands and the mutual aid of the entire town community. And to be honest, their organization in moments of chaos commands immense respect. Let's travel back to an era when every evening could be your last. We'll walk through narrow streets where thatched roofs almost touch one another. You'll feel that very same gnawing fear that kept people awake at night. This is not a story of destruction, but of astonishing human resilience and ingenuity. Get ready to be amazed by how our ancestors solved unsolvable problems with their bare hands. We're about to dive into a world of ashes, hooks, and leather buckets. Forget all those Hollywood movies where heroes leap gracefully through the flames. Reality was much grittier, harsher, and demanded incredible physical strength. But it was from this chaos that the principles of rescue we use today were born. So let's find out what happened when a house caught fire without firefighters or water. A medieval town was essentially a trap made of wood and straw. Houses were built from the cheapest and most readily available materials of the time. Stone was incredibly expensive, so it was used only for churches and castles. Ordinary people lived in frame houses filled with clay and dry branches. This structure dried out in the sun and turned into perfect kindling. Narrow streets made the situation even more dangerous and unpredictable. In some cities, the upper floors of houses overhung the street, forming a tunnel. Neighbors could literally pass salt to each other through a window on the other side of the street. When one house caught fire, the flames instantly spread to the opposite side. This created a wind tunnel effect that fanned the flames even more. Now we use fire-resistant materials and build wide avenues. Medieval city planners didn't think about such things because they were saving space. Cities were surrounded by defensive walls, and the space inside was worth a fortune. So people crammed their houses right up against each other, ignoring any safety concerns. It sounds like suicide, but they simply had no other choice. Open fires were the sole source of heat and light. Women cooked meals on hearths that burned right in the center of the room. In the evenings, homes were lit by tallow candles and pine torches that constantly sparked. Add to this the fact that the floors were often covered with dry straw for warmth. All it took was a single fallen candle for the entire house to turn into a crematorium. Modern fire safety experts would be horrified. Medieval cities violated absolutely every conceivable safety rule. Blacksmiths and bakers worked with furnaces right on the ground floors of residential buildings. Sparks flew onto wooden facades hundreds of times every day. It is not surprising that cities burned, but that they stood for so long at all. A fire in Rouen in the early 13th century destroyed the city completely. London burned with frightening regularity, losing thousands of buildings in a single night. People rebuilt their homes on the ashes, using the very same materials. It seems foolish, but wood remained the only available resource for most people. They simply accepted this risk as an inevitable part of their hard lives. The climate also played its cruel part in this fiery lottery. A long, dry summer turned thatched roofs into tinder ready to explode. Strong winds could carry burning embers hundreds of meters in all directions. There are documented cases where a single barn fire destroyed an entire neighborhood. The weather dictated the situation, and people could only watch the flames helplessly. But this is where things get truly interesting and unusual. Realizing the scale of the threat, medieval authorities began introducing the first building codes. In London, following yet another fire, thatching roofs with straw was banned. Residents were required to use tiles, or at least wooden planks. However, not everyone was able to comply with these rules due to the poverty of the population. Wealthy merchants were the first to realize that brick would save their capital. They began erecting stone firewalls between their wooden warehouses. If a neighbor's house caught fire, this solid wall would stop the fire from spreading. Today we see such firewalls in every modern building, but they were invented back then specifically to save goods from the inevitable ashes. Thus, the wooden trap gradually taught people to think ahead. Fire was a harsh teacher that did not forgive negligence or laziness. Every disaster forced society to take a tiny step towards safety. They couldn't change the laws of physics, but they could change how they organized themselves. And the next step was a system that forced neighbors to watch over one another. When the sun went down, the medieval city was plunged into an atmosphere of total paranoia. Darkness brought with it the greatest fear of a sudden fire. That is precisely why many European cities introduced a law regarding the evening bell. The French called it couvre-feu, which literally translates to cover the fire. The modern English word curfew derives from this term. At the sound of this bell, all residents were required to extinguish any open flames. Special metal covers were placed over fireplaces to prevent sparks from flying. If a guard spotted a light in a window after lights out, the homeowner faced a severe fine. It sounds like a dictatorship, but it was the only way to sleep peacefully at night. No one wanted to be woken up by a neighbor's crooked splinter catching fire. But there is another fascinating detail from those times. City authorities organized special night patrols to monitor the dark streets. Ordinary citizens took turns walking with lanterns and sniffing the air. If they smelled smoke, they were required to sound the alarm immediately. Your safety literally depended on the nose of a local baker or blacksmith. This work was dirty, cold, and completely unpaid. But refusing to take a night watch was practically impossible without consequences. People today often complain about their work schedules in a cozy office. Imagine being on duty outside in the winter, searching for a source of smoke. And if you miss a spark, your own home will burn to the ground too. The watchmen carried heavy halberds and wooden rattles. Upon spotting a flame, they would make the loudest, most grating sound possible. This noise woke up the entire street more effectively than any modern alarm clock. People would jump out of bed, grab buckets, and run out into the darkness. There was absolutely no time for hesitation or morning coffee. Panic in such moments was the community's greatest enemy. That is why some cities had strict rules of conduct during an alarm. Men were required to run to the fire, while women stayed at their homes with water. This resembles modern evacuation instructions, only stricter. The Romans used similar systems, but in the Middle Ages they had to be reinvented. Interestingly, paranoia drove people to spy on their neighbors. If someone knew that a neighbor liked to drink and fall asleep by the stove, they kept an eye on him. Social pressure worked better than any official safety inspector. No one hesitated to break into someone else's home if they saw dangerous sparks coming from the chimney. Personal boundaries ended where the threat of a general fire began. Modern psychology calls this collective group responsibility. Medieval people simply called it the desire to live to see the next morning. In cramped wooden housing, your life depended directly on the competence of others, and this formed incredibly close-knit, though suspicious, communities. Today, we may go years without knowing the name of our neighbor on the same flight of stairs. But what happened when the watchman's rattle finally shattered the night's silence? A phase began that could safely be called organized and bloody chaos. No fire trucks with flashing lights or professionals in fire-resistant suits. The city had to be saved by people in nightgowns and wooden shoes, and their main weapon was a simple human chain. This system of watch duty proved its incredible effectiveness over the centuries. Constant vigilance helped reduce the number of nighttime disasters in cities. People realized that prevention is cheaper than building a new house. Modern monitoring systems use the same principle, just with electronics. A smoke detector does today what a tired neighbor with a lantern did back then.
The shadows are long tonight.
So, the bell rings, and the whole neighborhood rushes out into the narrow street. There was no time for panic or lengthy deliberation about a plan of action. Medieval townspeople followed a strict protocol for forming a rescue chain. Women, children, and the elderly immediately lined up in a row, starting from the nearest well. Men ran into the thick of the fire to pour water directly onto the flames. This was the most effective system for delivering water before the invention of pumps. Full buckets were passed from hand to hand along one side of the human chain. Empty buckets were returned to the water source along the other side. Working in such a human chain was incredibly hard and dangerous. A leather bucket filled with water weighs about 10 kilograms. Passing it 100 times in a row is a task that would make your arms fall off. Now imagine doing this next to a burning building. The heat is so intense that the hairs on your eyebrows start to curl and smell of smoke. Discipline in these lines was enforced by the harshest methods. If someone dropped a bucket or broke the rhythm, they could literally be beaten. One person's mistake meant the loss of a precious second and valuable water. No excuses were accepted because the entire city was at stake. It was a cruel but fair mechanism for the crowd's survival. And the most surprising thing is that no one tried to extinguish the burning house itself. This contradicts all our modern instincts to save property. If a building caught fire, it was considered a lost cause and left to burn out. Water was poured exclusively on neighboring houses and their thatched roofs. The goal was to prevent the fire from spreading further down the street, but there was often a catastrophic shortage of water from wells for firefighting. Wooden houses burned at such high temperatures that the water simply evaporated. And that's when the most brutal weapon of medieval firefighters came into play. When water couldn't stop the flames, destruction was the next step. And for this, they used tools that looked like instruments of torture. Imagine a huge iron hook on a long wooden pole. It looked as if it could pull a whale out of the ocean. This very tool was the main weapon of medieval firefighting teams. It was called a fire hook, and it served one very brutal purpose. They literally tore houses to pieces with it to stop the fire. When the flames threatened to spread to the next block, a radical decision was made. A neighboring house, still untouched by the fire, had to be destroyed immediately. Men threw iron hooks onto the wooden roof beams and walls. Then they attached thick ropes to them and pulled with all their might. The wooden framed building crashed to the ground with a crash, creating a buffer zone. This method sounds like pure barbarism and savagery. Demolishing an entire house just in case seems like madness. But modern experts call this creating a fire break. Without fuel, the fire cannot spread further and gradually dies out. The Romans did the same thing, and this method still works today in forest fires. The hooks themselves were incredibly heavy and required collective strength. Usually 5 to 10 strong men pulled on a single rope. They had to work in sync like river barge haulers. If the beam fell the wrong way, it could crush the rescuers themselves. This required precise calculation and a cool head in moments of panic. Every parish or district kept several such hooks in storage. They hung on the walls of churches so they could be grabbed quickly. The church was not only a spiritual center, but also a warehouse for equipment. Ropes, leather buckets, and even ladders were often stored there as well. Religion and survival went hand in those days. Some houses were dismantled so quickly that it boggles the imagination. Medieval carpenters built structures using wooden pegs without nails. If the right beams were pulled out, the house would collapse like a house of cards. It was like a giant, deadly game of Jenga, and these guys were true masters of controlled demolition. Today, firefighters use chainsaws and hydraulic cutters. They can carefully pry open a door or cut through a roof. Our ancestors didn't have that luxury or the time to spare. They relied on brute muscle power and the laws of physics. My shoulders start to ache just thinking about such hard work. The tactics for demolishing houses were brutal, but mathematically sound. Better to lose 5 buildings than to let 500 burn down. And although the hooks left ruins in their wake, they saved civilization. However, even a demolished house left smouldering debris behind. And here we return to the biggest problem, the water shortage. The main tragedy of medieval fires lay in the logistics of water. You can gather thousands of people into a human chain of buckets. You can tear down hundreds of houses with iron hooks. But if the well is empty, your city will still turn to ashes. And wells in those days dried up with frightening regularity. Before the invention of pressurized water mains, water was a heavy burden. On an ordinary day, women spent hours carrying it home. During a fire, the need for water increased 1,000-fold. City reservoirs were emptied within the first 30 minutes of intense firefighting. After that, all that remained was to hope for a miracle or heavy rain. Many cities were located on the banks of large rivers. It would seem, here it is, an endless source of free water for everyone. But try running from the city center to the river with buckets. The distance of a mile made delivering water a completely pointless endeavor. By the time a bucket reached the fire, the house had already burned to the ground. That is why wise rulers began to create artificial reserves. In some courtyards, it was mandatory to keep huge oak barrels filled with rainwater. These barrels were forbidden to be used for laundry or washing dishes. The water in them grew mouldy, went bad, and smelt simply disgusting. But for extinguishing a fire, the quality of the liquid did not matter at all. Interestingly, the dirt in such water sometimes even helped the cause. The murky, clay-filled sludge better enveloped the burning surfaces. It created a crust that blocked oxygen from reaching the wood. Modern firefighters use special foam for the very same purposes. Medieval people achieved this effect by accident, using stagnant swamp water. Another surprising solution was the use of beer supplies. It sounds like a joke, but beer saved quite a few buildings in Europe. There were many breweries, and they stored huge vats of the liquid. When the wells ran dry, the foamy treasure of local taverns came into play. And the most interesting thing is that beer extinguishes fire slightly more effectively than ordinary water. By the 15th century, engineers had begun to think about pumps. The first primitive hand pumps with wooden wheels appeared. They looked like giant syringes that were operated by several people at once. The pressure was weak, and the jet only reached a few meters. But this was the first step toward the mechanization of rescue operations. These machines were called water syringes, and they were incredibly expensive. Only the wealthiest guilds or city councils could afford them. The mechanisms often broke down right in the middle of fighting the flames. Debris, mud, and stones from the river water would get stuck inside. And then people had to resort to the tried and true leather buckets again. Modern fire hydrants deliver thousands of liters of water per minute. A firefighter simply opens the valve and gets an endless stream. In the Middle Ages, every liter was earned through blood and sweat. This scarcity of resources taught people to value every drop of liquid. You wouldn't waste water if you'd carried it half a kilometer yourself. The experience of constant fires forced urban planners to change their approach to water. New cities began to be planned around a system of canals and large reservoirs. People realized that access to water was more important than the convenience of trade routes. This lesson cost Europe millions of burned-down houses and shattered lives. And until there were water pipes, all hope rested on a simple bucket. Let's talk about the most underrated object of the Middle Ages. An ordinary fire bucket looks boring to the modern, spoiled eye, but in reality, it was a masterpiece of engineering for its time. Coopers and leatherworkers created a tool perfectly suited for extreme conditions, and the shape of these buckets was radically different from what we use today. First, they never had a flat bottom. They had a convex or cone-shaped base, like a torpedo. Why complicate the design of a simple water container like that? So that no one could set it on the ground and use it for everyday purposes. A bucket with a round bottom immediately tips over, spilling all the liquid onto the floor. This ingenious solution protected firefighting equipment from theft. A peasant couldn't take such a bucket to milk a cow. The tool always remained in its place, waiting for the alarm. Modern designers call this foolproofing. Medieval craftsmen applied this principle long before the advent of such clever terms. They were made from very thick and stiff cowhide. Wooden buckets were too heavy and broke easily when dropped. Metal ones cost a fortune and heated up quickly from the fire. Leather was light, durable, and didn't burn rescuers' hands. The seams were impregnated with resin, so the vessel wouldn't leak during transfer. Every item was stamped with the guild's mark or the owner's coat of arms. After a fire, empty buckets would pile up in a massive heap on the street. They had to be sorted out and returned to their rightful owners without any fights. The markings helped quickly restore order to this chaos. It was the precursor to inventory numbers on modern equipment. The production of such buckets became an incredibly profitable business. Cities purchased them by the thousands to supply every district. Leatherworkers received massive government contracts and grew rich before everyone's eyes. While some faced war and fire, others saw a golden opportunity to earn gold coins. The economy of disasters has always operated by its own cynical laws. Interestingly, the repair of this equipment was also strictly controlled. A damaged bucket was considered a crime against the city's public safety. Special inspectors went around the courtyards and checked the condition of the leather. If the vessel leaked, the owner faced trial and public censure. Safety was maintained through fear of punishment, not through high civic consciousness. I once tried to lift a full-scale replica of such a bucket. My arms felt a weight that seemed much greater than 10 kilograms. The balance, due to the conical bottom, constantly shifts, requiring muscle tension. Now imagine doing this while exhausted after a march. These people had nerves of steel and incredible endurance. An ordinary leather bucket saved more European cities than kings. It was a symbol of that era, rough, smelly, but reliable. We've grown accustomed to complex technology that breaks down from dust. This medieval tool worked flawlessly under the most hellish conditions, but even the best equipment couldn't save them from human stupidity. If you think modern laws are strict, take a look at the Middle Ages. The punishments for arson or even carelessness were absolutely merciless. The authorities understood only one language, the language of total terror. A person whose negligence caused a city to burn rarely lived to see the trial. An enraged mob of neighbors meted out justice right on the smoldering ruins. Arsonists faced the most terrible fate of all. They were usually sentenced to be burned at the stake in the town square. This was a symbolic punishment meant to highlight the irony of justice. Fire for fire, that was the main rule of medieval criminal justice. And after such spectacles, the number of people willing to play with matches dropped sharply. But what if a fire started accidentally, due to a simple mistake? The law didn't make much distinction between malicious intent and mere negligence. If your fallen candle burned down your neighbor's house, you paid a fine, and the amount of that fine was such that a person became destitute. They had to sell themselves into slavery to cover the damage caused. That is why many of the culprits preferred to flee the city before dawn. They abandoned what remained of their possessions and hid in the dense forests. Becoming an outcast was better than hanging from a noose in the town square. The city archives are full of records of people who disappeared after major fires. The fear of the community's vengeance was stronger than any attachment to one's hometown. Special inspection teams were created to monitor stoves. Officials went from house to house, checking the construction of chimneys and fireplaces. If a stove seemed dangerous to them, they could smash it with a sledgehammer on the spot. No one asked for a search warrant or court permission. The safety of the majority always outweighed the rights of any one individual. Craftsmen who used open fires were subject to particularly strict controls. Blacksmiths were forced to move their workshops to bodies of water on the outskirts. Bakers were forbidden to work at night while everyone else slept peacefully. This ruined their businesses, but the authorities were adamant in their decision. Lawsuits and complaints from the guilds were simply ignored by the city magistrates. Interestingly, some places even introduced a tax on smoking. When tobacco first appeared in Europe, it caused numerous fires. People would fall asleep with pipes in their mouths on straw mattresses. The authorities quickly realized the connection and imposed huge duties on smokers. Modern cigarette taxes have the same historical roots. Sometimes the paranoia reached the point of utter legislative absurdity. In some German cities, it was forbidden to keep firewood that was too dry at home. People were forced to lightly dampen the wood so it wouldn't catch fire instantly. This caused stoves to smoke incredibly heavily, and people choked on the fumes. But the logic was simple: smoke kills more slowly than a bright flame. All these draconian measures eventually yielded positive results. The number of accidental household fires began to decline gradually but steadily. The fear of losing all their possessions and their lives forced people to be more careful. We complain about fire inspections in our offices. Be thankful that the inspector can't burn you at the stake. This is how a safety culture based on pain and fines took shape. Society slowly learned to manage its most destructive force. But there was one problem that lawmakers couldn't solve for a long time. This problem lurked inside homes, gathering black and sticky death. I'm talking about chimneys and the people who were required to clean them. The invention of the chimney was a huge step forward for comfort. No longer did people have to breathe the acrid smoke that filled the room. But this innovation brought with it an invisible and insidious threat. Combustible soot began to accumulate on the inner walls of the narrow pipes. This substance is called creosote, and it burns like napalm. A chimney fire is one of the most terrifying sights. The pipe begins to roar like a jet engine during takeoff. A column of flame bursts from the top, showering the entire roof with sparks. It is practically impossible to extinguish such a fire from the outside due to the chimney's design. The house burns from the inside while you try to douse the roof with water. That is precisely why a profession emerged that became a symbol of urban folklore. Chimney sweeps were the people who did the dirtiest job in the world. They had to scrape creosote off the walls, preventing terrible disasters. Without their regular work, any stone house would eventually turn into a time bomb. Their profession was the guarantee that the city wouldn't blow up. But the reality of this work was far from cheerful fairy tales. Often the chimneys were so narrow that an adult would get stuck inside. That's why the masters hired young orphan boys for this hellish task. The children crawled through narrow, dark shafts, choking on poisonous dust. This is a dark chapter in history that is rarely taught in school. Chimney sweeps used stiff brushes and metal scrapers. They lowered them on ropes if the chimney was straight. But medieval architects loved to build curved chimneys with complex shapes. It was believed that this better retained heat inside a large building. That is why it was simply impossible to do without a living person inside. Interestingly, chimney sweeps were often considered a symbol of good luck. People believed that touching a soot-covered person brought good luck. In reality, the good luck lay in a different, more practical matter. If a chimney sweep left your house, it meant you wouldn't burn down that day. It makes perfect sense to view the savior of your property as a harbinger of good news. Authorities required city residents to have their chimneys swept at least twice a year. If a fire broke out, inspectors would first check the condition of the chimney. If it was clogged with soot, the homeowner would pay a fine for negligence. Receipts from chimney sweeps had to be kept as key evidence of innocence. This is very similar to modern vehicle inspection certificates. The profession evolved, and over time, more humane methods emerged. Telescopic poles and heavy weights were invented to break through blockages. The use of children in Europe was not banned until the 19th century. Until then, thousands of lives had been sacrificed for safety. Fire claimed its victims even when it wasn't burning. Experience with chimneys taught people the importance of prevention. They realized that preventing a disaster was easier than swinging hooks around at night. This principle became the foundation of the entire modern fire safety system. But to fully solve the problem, the cities themselves had to change. Wood had to give way to a material that wasn't afraid of sparks. The Great Fires of London became a catalyst for global architectural change. When the city burned to the ground, King Charles issued a historic decree. No more wooden frames or thatched roofs in the centre of the capital. The new London was to be rebuilt in brick, stone and lead. It was an incredibly expensive but vitally necessary step for survival. The transition to stone was slow and met with enormous resistance. People complained about the high cost of materials and the shortage of skilled masons. Bricks had to be fired, which in itself required fire, but the government understood. Better to go broke once than to burn down every decade. Subsidies and tax breaks helped citizens rebuild their homes. Along with the materials, the very structure of the city streets changed. Narrow, winding alleys began to be replaced by wide, straight avenues. This was done not for aesthetic reasons, but to stop the spread of flames. A wide street served as a natural fire break for an entire neighborhood. Fire simply could not jump across a 30-meter wide stone pavement. Architects began designing buildings with solid side walls. These walls had no windows, so flames could not penetrate inside. Firewalls became a mandatory element of any new urban development. If one house burned, the neighboring one remained completely unscathed. This ingenious invention saved thousands of lives in the centuries that followed. Interestingly, stone houses even changed the indoor climate. Stone heats up more slowly and retains heat longer in winter. People began using less firewood to heat their rooms. Less firewood meant fewer open fires and a lower risk of fire. It was a perfect chain reaction leading to universal safety. But old habits died hard and with great difficulty. Peasants in the suburbs continued to build cheap wooden shacks. City authorities had to forcibly demolish illegal, flammable structures. There were actual riots against stone architecture and the new rules. Progress always forces its way through the discontent of ordinary people. With the development of stone construction, the first insurance companies appeared. They assessed risks and issued policies to owners of sturdy homes. Insurers even created their own professional firefighting teams. These teams extinguished fires only in homes displaying the company's sign. Capitalism took the fight against fire into its own grasping hands. If a burning house lacked the required sign, firefighters simply stood by. They could turn around and leave, letting the building burn to the ground. It sounds wild, but that's exactly how the first commercial rescue services operated. Safety had finally become a commodity that had to be purchased. The poor still relied solely on leather buckets and their neighbors. Modern megacities of glass and concrete owe their appearance to those fires. The building codes we now consider tedious bureaucracy were written in ashes. Every clause in the fire safety regulations represents someone's life lost to the flames. A wooden city was a romantic but utterly unviable concept. Fire forced humanity to grow up and become wiser in architecture. Stone defeated wood, and reason defeated blind panic. Gradually, the need to tear down houses with iron hooks disappeared. Night watchmen became a thing of the past, giving way to professionals. But the spirit of those first rescuers has remained in history forever, and their experience gave us systems without which the modern world would collapse. Looking back, medieval methods seem brutal and primitive. Beating neighbors for spilled water and breaking down houses with hooks is strange, but it was precisely in this chaos that the main principles of modern rescue were born. Isolate the source, create a buffer zone, ensure an uninterrupted water supply. Today, we do the same thing, simply using helicopters and fire hydrants. The concept of collective responsibility became the foundation of civil society. People realized that it is impossible to survive alone in the city. Your safety ends where your neighbor's foolishness begins. This forced people to unite into voluntary militias and guilds. Social bonds strengthened more quickly under the threat of a common fiery enemy. We have also inherited the idea of strict building codes. When a developer argues with an inspector over the width of a hallway, that's history. The width of a hallway is calculated so that a crowd can rush outside. Medieval streets were narrow, and people often died in stampedes. Our rules are written so that we do not repeat their mistakes. The leather bucket has evolved into sophisticated pump stations and fire hoses, but the principle of rapid response has remained absolutely unchanged since then. In firefighting, every precious second counts. The firefighter on duty, sleeping in his uniform by the truck, is a direct descendant of the night watchman. Both wait for the sound that will make them spring into action. Modern scientists study the dynamics of fire using computers. They create models of how flames move through buildings. Medieval people learnt this through practical experience, losing their homes in the process. Their empirical knowledge cost them all the property they had acquired through backbreaking labor. We benefit from the fruits of their painful experience every single day. It's funny that we're returning to wood in modern architecture. New technologies make it possible to make wood resistant to direct flames. A medieval peasant would have viewed a wooden skyscraper as madness. He would have concluded that we had simply gone mad from a life of plenty. Perhaps, in some ways, this weary man from the past would have been right. The fear of fire remains deep within our genes. We still freeze when we hear a siren wailing in the street. This primal instinct warns us of the greatest danger. Fire was humanity's first tool, but also its first executioner, and this dual nature is what makes it so mesmerizing and terrifying. I want you to remember this as you walk past a fire extinguisher. That red canister on the wall is the result of hundreds of years of evolution. It contains a power our ancestors could only dream of. You hold in your hands magic capable of stopping a monster in seconds. Appreciate it, because in the past, people had to tear down their own homes. The history of firefighting is a story of human perseverance. Cities burned to the ground, but people stubbornly rebuilt them. They didn't surrender to the elements, they learned to control them. It's an incredible example of how a species adapts to challenging conditions. And it is precisely this trait that has made us the dominant species on the planet. We continue to battle fires in forests and megacities. But now we are armed with knowledge passed down to us through the centuries. Every rule and every tool has its own long, bloody history. To know it is to respect the labor of those who fought without water. They laid the foundation for the safe world in which we live. This was the reality in which our ancestors lived. No romantic tales of knights and beautiful ladies in castles. Only a constant, exhausting struggle for survival every dark night. The Middle Ages were dirty, harsh, and smelled of burnt wood. But out of this harshness, truly ingenious solutions and systems were born. The next time you complain about noisy neighbors, think about it. In the 14th century, you would have prayed that your neighbor wouldn't fall asleep. You would have been grateful for his light sleep and quick reaction to smoke. Our comfort often blinds us to basic survival issues. We've delegated our safety to professionals and forgotten how to take care of ourselves. I hope this story has changed your view of the past. Medieval people weren't fools running in panic through the streets. They were tough, pragmatic, and incredibly organized in times of crisis. Their methods are frightening, but they worked under conditions of absolute scarcity. And therein lies the true beauty of historical engineering. We've explored why wooden towns burned like dry gunpowder. We've seen how night watchmen battled paranoia and darkness. You learned why demolishing your neighbor's house was the best plan for survival. And now you understand the hidden genius of a simple leather bucket. All these pieces come together to form an amazing picture of human resilience. If you enjoyed this in-depth historical analysis, let me know. History hides many more incredible systems and forgotten technologies. We're used to studying the wars of kings, forgetting about the everyday struggles of ordinary people. Yet it was precisely there that the most interesting and dramatic events took place. The survival of the common person always requires maximum ingenuity and cunning. Write in the comments which facts surprised you the most. Was it the night watch, the destruction of houses, or the leather buckets? Perhaps you wouldn't have survived a single day in medieval London. Or maybe you would have made an excellent commander of a rescue chain. Share your thoughts, because history only comes alive through discussion. Don't forget to check the batteries in your home smoke detectors. Our ancestors would have given all the gold in the world for such a small plastic box. Protect yourself and your home from careless use of fire. Nature does not forgive mistakes, whether in the 13th or the 21st century. Be smarter than the guy with the dropped candle in the straw house. Many more amazing discoveries from the past await us. we will continue to explore how people solved unsolvable problems. Subscribe so you don't miss new journeys deep into the centuries and millennia. This is a channel where history ceases to be a boring list of dates from a textbook. Here, the past comes alive and reveals its darkest, most authentic aspects. Thank you for watching this long and detailed story all the way through. Your attention to detail makes creating such stories truly worthwhile. Remember that knowledge of the past helps us build a safer future. This has been the voice of history, echoing through the centuries and the ashes. Until we meet again, and may your nights always be peaceful.
Imagine you are in a huge stone fortress, and the temperature inside is lower than outside. A blizzard rages outside the walls, and inside the icy air burns your lungs. Even the thickest stone walls cannot retain heat, and the massive doors and tiny windows only exacerbate the situation. Every breath turns into a cloud of steam, and you can feel the cold penetrating every cell of your body. This is not an excerpt from a fantasy novel or movie. It is the reality that the inhabitants of European castles faced for many centuries. The castles we see today as majestic architectural monuments were actually harsh, cold, and gloomy places, especially in winter. Today, we will reveal the truth about how people lived in these icy fortresses, why they were so difficult to heat, and what tricks they used to keep from freezing. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how even in the harshest conditions, people found ways to survive and preserve themselves. Medieval castles were built primarily as defensive structures, not as comfortable dwellings. Their main purpose was to protect against enemies, not the cold.
I've never known such cold.
The thick stone walls, which were designed to withstand the blows of battering rams and siege weapons, actually functioned as powerful heat sinks. Stone is excellent at conducting and retaining low temperatures. If it was freezing outside, the walls inside the castle would also become icy. This cold armor prevented the heat generated inside from accumulating. The huge halls with high ceilings designed for ceremonial receptions and feasts were almost impossible to heat. All the warm air immediately rose and escaped through cracks in the roof and tiny windows. The ventilation, which was necessary to remove smoke from open hearths, only exacerbated the draft effect. Therefore, the air in the castle constantly circulated, and the heat did not linger. In addition to the obvious heating problems, the very architecture of the castles created additional difficulties. The massive stone arches and floors not only retained the cold, but also slowly but surely released it into the space, creating a feeling of constant chill. The floor was especially icy, as it was in direct contact with the ground. The cold rose from below, and even thick boots did not always protect against the penetrating chill. Footwear at that time was simple and did not have effective thermal insulation, which made standing on the stone floor even more unbearable. The location of castles on high ground, which was strategically advantageous from a defensive point of view, also made them vulnerable to the winds. Gusts of wind penetrated through narrow loopholes and cracks in the doors, creating drafts that were impossible to hide from. These drafts constantly stirred the air in the rooms, preventing it from warming up even from the hearths. In winter, the air in the castle was so cold that you could see your breath, and breathing felt heavy and icy. In such conditions, even simple everyday tasks became a test of endurance. The construction technologies of the time did not allow for the creation of airtight structures. The mortar used to bind the stones crumbled over time, leaving small gaps and cracks. These gaps, initially invisible, became channels for cold air, which penetrated the walls and cooled them even more. The windows in the castles, which were small and had no glass, were closed with wooden shutters, but even these did not provide a complete seal. They were often made of roughly hewn boards, which warped over time, forming gaps between them. Winter days in the castle were short and gloomy. Light penetrated only through narrow loopholes and small windows. This created an atmosphere not only of cold, but also of constant semi-darkness. Torches and candles were used for additional lighting, but they provided little light and heat and burned out quickly. Life in such conditions required incredible resilience. Every night and every day was a challenge, and people were constantly looking for ways to withstand the elements. They didn't just want to survive, they sought at least some semblance of comfort. Life in a castle in winter was inherently associated with constant cold. Even during meals or socializing, people had to wear their outer clothing. Castle baths or hot water vats were rare and only available to the most high-ranking individuals. Therefore, hygiene procedures were carried out in cold conditions, which made them even more unpleasant. All of life was subordinated to the struggle for warmth, from sleep and wakefulness to eating. Share in the comments which medieval castle you would choose if you knew you would have to spend a cold winter there. And write what you think was the most effective way to keep warm. The simplest and most obvious way to heat a room was with an open hearth in the middle of the main hall. Wood was placed in the hearth, which burned, spreading heat and light. However, this method was extremely inefficient. First, an open fire did not provide much heat, and smoke filled the entire room. Despite the openings in the roof, smoke settled on the walls and objects, creating a persistent smell and soot. Later, wall-mounted fireplaces appeared. They were more efficient because the smoke went out through a pipe in the wall instead of rising upward. However, they had their own problems. Fireplaces only provided heat nearby. The further you moved away from the fire, the colder it got. In addition, heating the castle required a huge amount of firewood. Entire wood piles could be burned in a single day. Delivering and storing such a large amount of fuel was a separate problem.
It is very cold tonight.
Come closer to the fire.
The lack of heat from the fireplaces meant that the castle's inhabitants were forced to stay close to the source of the fire. During the cold months, all life was concentrated in 1 or 2 rooms where the hearths burned. This meant that personal space was virtually unavailable, and people lived in constant crowding. Even the owners of the castle, unlike in movies, could not enjoy privacy in their bedrooms, because it was just as cold there as everywhere else. The family, servants, and guests all gathered around the fireplace to keep warm, which created both social and domestic difficulties. Preparing firewood was one of the most important tasks. In summer and autumn, people worked hard to provide themselves with fuel for the whole winter. Huge wood piles were stacked in the courtyards of castles, and their size could say a lot about the wealth of the owner. If the firewood supplies ran out ahead of time, it could lead to a real disaster. During a siege or a prolonged snowstorm, when it was impossible to deliver new fuel, the castle was in danger of freezing completely. Burning wood was not only a source of heat, but also a symbol of life and safety. In addition to firewood, peat, which gave off more heat but produced more smoke, or coal, which was more efficient but much more expensive and difficult to obtain, could be burned in the hearths. The use of these alternative fuels depended on the geographical location of the castle. However, firewood remained the main fuel for centuries, dictating the entire way of life. Chimneys, which were supposed to remove smoke, often became clogged with soot and required regular cleaning. This process was laborious and dangerous. Constant smoke in the rooms, even with a fireplace, was a serious problem. It not only stained the walls and clothes, but also had a negative impact on health. Soot settled on furniture, books, and tapestries. The persistent smell of smoke permeated everything: clothes, hair, skin. This smell was an integral part of life in the castle, and it was impossible to get rid of it. Even dishes and cooked food smelled of smoke to some extent. Despite all these difficulties, people continued to search for solutions. This constant striving for comfort and warmth is so characteristic of human beings, but it has not always been easy to achieve. What if we lived in a world where warmth was not a given, but a luxury that had to be fought for every day? What would we be willing to give up for a single day spent in warmth? To find out what other unexpected solutions people came up with, watch the video to the end. Since it was almost impossible to heat the air in the castle, people focused on at least insulating themselves from the cold. One of the most effective solutions was tapestries and thick woolen curtains. These dense woven fabrics were hung on the walls to create an additional layer of insulation. Tapestries not only protected against the cold, but also helped to retain heat inside small, isolated spaces. They were hung on stone walls to reduce heat loss, and were also used to create improvised rooms inside large halls. For example, in the bedroom, tapestries were hung around the bed to create a kind of tent. This way, people did not have to heat the entire room, but only a small space around themselves. This solution was not only practical, but also prestigious. Creating tapestries was a laborious and expensive process, so their presence indicated the wealth of the castle's owner. And the more tapestries hung on the walls, the warmer and cozier the room was. The use of tapestries as thermal insulation was a brilliant but necessary solution. The castle's thick, massive stone walls were constantly cold because they could not warm up quickly from the fire. They served as a kind of refrigerator that constantly drew heat from the air. To counteract this, people hung wool and linen cloths on the walls, which served as a barrier between the cold stone and the living space. This not only helped to retain heat, but also created an illusion of comfort and coziness. Tapestries and curtains also played an important role in dividing large rooms into zones. In huge rooms where people ate, slept, and worked, these woven partitions helped create small, warmer areas. For example, curtains could separate the sleeping area from the rest of the hall, allowing body heat to be retained in a confined space. This room-within-a-room principle was essential for ensuring a minimum level of comfort. In addition, tapestries helped to hide gaps in the walls and windows through which cold air penetrated. In addition to tapestries, other woven items were also used. Thick woolen blankets and throws were draped over shoulders and knees, and were also used to provide additional warmth for beds. Fur skins, which were even more effective at retaining heat, were used as rugs on the floor, as bedspreads, and even as linings for clothing. These items not only served a practical purpose, but were also a symbol of wealth. The more fur and expensive fabrics there were in the castle, the higher the status of its owner. The production of tapestries was a true art form. Weavers worked for weeks and sometimes months on a single piece, using complex techniques and expensive dyes. The intricate patterns and historical scenes depicted on tapestries transformed them from simple insulation into works of art. These items were passed down from generation to generation, becoming family heirlooms. But their practical purpose was never forgotten. Castle owners kept entire inventory lists of tapestries and curtains so that they could be quickly moved if necessary, for example, when moving to another residence or during military operations. Interestingly, the practice of using textiles for insulation continued for many centuries, even after the advent of more sophisticated heating systems. Tapestries continued to adorn the walls of castles and palaces, but their original function as a means of combating the cold remained in history. Initially, they were not just a decoration, but a necessity of life that helped people survive in harsh conditions. They were a kind of shield against the piercing cold that penetrated every corner of the castle.
It is truly a marvel, isn't it, the way the fire holds the cold at bay.
As a result, tapestries and curtains became not only a decorative element, but also a symbol of human ingenuity and the desire to survive. They proved that even in the most unfavorable conditions, people found a way to create acceptable conditions for themselves. Studying the history of castles, we see that behind their massive walls lay not only power and authority, but also a constant struggle with nature. Unlike open hearths and fireplaces, stoves were a much more efficient way of heating. They were closed structures made of stone or brick, where the fire burned inside and the heat from the hot walls was transferred to the room. The smoke escaped through the chimney without polluting the air. Stoves first appeared in what is now Germany and Scandinavia, where the climate was particularly harsh. However, their spread was slow. The reason was that stoves required a more complex design than simple fireplaces. It was necessary to think through a system of chimneys, which did not always fit into existing castle structures. Nevertheless, stoves offered many advantages. They could retain heat for a long time after the fire had gone out and heat the room evenly. Over time, stoves began to be made of tiles, which not only accumulated heat but also decorated the interior. The introduction of stoves into castle architecture was a real breakthrough. Unlike fireplaces, which created a localized area of heat, stoves heated the entire volume of the room. This was because the heat from the heated walls of the stove radiated in all directions rather than escaping up the chimney. In addition, stoves did not require constant supervision. It was enough to load them with wood once and light them, and the stove would give off the accumulated heat for a long time. However, installing a stove in an already built castle was a difficult task. This often required major changes to the layout, which was expensive and not always possible. New castles, which were built in later periods, were originally designed with stove heating in mind. In such castles, chimneys were laid inside the walls, which allowed the heat to be evenly distributed throughout the different rooms. Such systems were not only effective, but also saved space. In addition to stationary stoves, there were other options. In some regions of Europe, mobile stoves were used, which could be moved from one room to another, which was especially convenient in large castles, where it was unprofitable to heat all rooms at once. These stoves were smaller in size and did not have a complex chimney system, which made them less efficient but more flexible in use. They were most often installed in small rooms or in the Lord's chambers, where more heat was required. The tiles used to cover the stoves were not only beautiful, but also very practical. They were made of fired clay and had a high heat capacity, which allowed them to retain heat for a long time and release it into the room. Tiles were often decorated with intricate patterns, heraldic symbols, and scenes from everyday life, turning the stove into a true work of art. This was further proof that even the most practical items in a castle had to match the status of its owner. Despite all their advantages, stoves did not become a universal solution. Many old castles simply could not be converted to stove heating, and the owners did not want to spend huge sums on reconstruction. In addition, high-quality fuel was required to fire the stoves, which was not always available. Fireplaces, despite their inefficiency, were simpler and cheaper to install and operate. That is why fireplaces and open hearths continued to dominate castles for centuries. But why did stoves not become a widespread solution in castles? And what solution was better than stoves? We will find out very soon. Don't switch off the video. In addition to fundamental solutions, such as tapestries and stoves, people resorted to a variety of little tricks to keep warm. For example, they placed heated stones or vessels with hot water in their beds. This allowed them to warm up their beds before going to sleep and not freeze at night. Woolen blankets and fur skins were also widely used, serving not only for warmth, but also for additional insulation. They were thrown over chairs, laid on the floor to avoid standing on cold stone, and, of course, wrapped around people. Fur was especially valuable because it retained heat very well. Another way to keep warm was simply to gather together. People spent their evenings in one large room with a burning hearth. The heat generated by many bodies helped to maintain the temperature. And of course, we mustn't forget about warm food and drinks, which warmed people up from the inside, at least for a while. These small but very important tricks help people survive the harshest frosts. For example, heated stones were a simple and affordable method. Stones heated in the hearth were wrapped in cloth to avoid burns and placed in bed. They slowly gave off heat, warming the bed and allowing the person to fall asleep. Over time, stones were replaced by ceramic hot water bottles filled with hot water. This was a more convenient and safer solution. Some historical documents mention that servants prepared such hot water bottles for their masters before bedtime. Fur skins were a real luxury, but their practicality was undeniable. They were used for everything from floor coverings to bedspreads. Fox, bear, and sable skins were especially prized because they were very warm. Even the wealthiest people did not shy away from using fur in their daily lives. Because it was not just a luxury, but a necessity. Skins were often placed on chairs near fireplaces so that those sitting on them would not feel the cold of the stone, which even clothing could not protect against. Gathering together around the hearth was not only a social, but also a purely practical decision. The heat emitted by the bodies created a kind of microclimate in the room. This allowed them to save firewood and maintain a temperature that was slightly higher than in other parts of the castle. On cold winter nights, people often slept in one large room to keep warm. This applied not only to the nobility, but also to their servants, who often slept directly on the floor in their master's chambers so that their body heat would help maintain the temperature. This was not a sign of disrespect, but a necessary measure. Warm food and drinks also played an important role. Hot soups, stewed meat, and hot wine or ale helped to warm people up from the inside. Castles always prepared a lot of food, which was not only nutritious, but also hot. This was especially important during cold spells. Hot ale or wine was drunk to keep warm and also for disinfection, as water was often cold. Another trick was to use thick pillows and wool blankets. Wool is an excellent insulator and was used in large quantities. Pillows stuffed with wool were placed not only under the head, but also under the back to protect against the cold stone walls. Layering was a key principle. People wore many layers of clothing and used several blankets in bed to create an air gap that retained heat. These little tricks, accumulated over centuries, helped people not only survive, but also make their lives in the icy fortresses a little more bearable. Many historical chronicles and letters from that time tell of the unbearable cold in castles. For example, the Chronicles of the French Kings contain records of how courtiers complained about the piercing cold in the Louvre, which at that time was not yet a palace in the modern sense. There is evidence that frozen rivers were used as roads in winter, and ice in castles was not uncommon. Reports and inventory lists from that time often mention large quantities of firewood, which indicates constant attempts to heat the premises. Some castles even had special rooms that were heated only in winter. Documents preserved from those times mention that in some castles, even the water in jugs standing in the chambers froze in winter. This suggests that the temperature inside the rooms could drop below zero. Windows made of thin mica or parchment, and often absent altogether, let in the cold and wind, making life even more unbearable. People tried to spend as much time as possible in the kitchen, where a large hearth burned and food was prepared. It was one of the warmest places in the castle, and it was always bustling with activity. The extent to which people suffered from the cold can be judged from their letters and diaries. Many complained of constant colds and joint pain caused by the unbearable conditions. The cold was not just a discomfort, but a serious threat to health. There are preserved references to how lords and their families, returning from trips, immediately headed for the fireplace and demanded that hot wine or ale be brought to them to warm up. Interestingly, only the rooms where meals were taken and the lord and lady's chambers were heated. The rest of the castle, including the guest rooms, servants' bedrooms, and even the armory, remained cold. This was because firewood supplies were limited and had to be conserved. During the cold season, many servants preferred to sleep in the Great Hall, where the fireplace was lit, or in their own rooms, covered with all the blankets and furs they could find. Castles were not only military structures, but also centers of government and trade. They were used to hold court, receive ambassadors, and conclude deals. But all these important matters had to be conducted in conditions that seem unacceptable to us today. Even during formal receptions, when many people gathered, the temperature in the hall was so low that guests did not take off their cloaks and fur capes. Cold was a constant backdrop to all events taking place in the castle. Another indication of the cold was the inventory lists. They often specified the amount of firewood that had to be prepared for the winter, which emphasizes how important a resource it was. In addition, the inventories mention a large number of blankets, skins, and tapestries that were used for warmth. These were not just household items, but vital things that helped people survive. Of course, in such conditions, people could not expect the comforts we are accustomed to. Nevertheless, they did not give up and continued to look for ways to keep warm. And one of those ways was fashion. But how can fashion keep you warm? Watch until the end to find out why it was customary to dress like a cabbage in the Middle Ages. Clothing played a key role in survival. Unlike the light and elegant outfits we see in movies, real medieval clothing was layered and warm. People wore several layers of linen and wool undergarments. Outerwear was made of thick, heavy fabrics. In winter, people often wore fur linings under their clothes. Fur coats and cloaks were an integral part of the wardrobe. Mittens and headwear were important not only for outdoors, but also indoors. Even during formal receptions and feasts, people sat in their warm cloaks because the halls were so cold that it was impossible to survive without them. Clothing was not only a way to express one's status, but also a necessity of life. The most important principle was layering. Under the outer clothing, several layers of linen and woolen shirts were worn, which created an airy layer. This layer acted as a heat insulator, preventing body heat from escaping. The shirts were made of linen, which was softer and more comfortable against the skin, and woolen tunics were worn over them to better retain heat. Outerwear was particularly heavy and thick. Cloaks and capes were made of thick wool, often with the addition of fur, and were an essential part of the wardrobe. Men wore long tunics, knee-length or longer, and women wore long dresses. These outfits were not the most comfortable for active movement, but they provided excellent protection from the cold. The clothes were not only warm, but also durable, as they were made to last for centuries. The materials were expensive, so the clothes were cherished, repaired, and passed down from generation to generation. Fur was a real luxury, but it was used not only for decoration, but also for warmth. Fur-lined coats were worn under cloaks. Fur was used to line collars, sleeves, and hems of clothing, which helped to retain heat. Sometimes they even used fur stockings, which were worn under shoes to keep feet warm on cold stone floors. Fur was a symbol of wealth and status, but its main purpose was purely practical, to keep its owner warm. Headwear and mittens were an integral part of the winter wardrobe. It was so cold indoors that people did not take off their headwear. They were not only a fashion accessory, but also protection from drafts and the cold that penetrated through the walls. Mittens helped keep hands warm when a person was writing, working, or simply sitting by the hearth. Interestingly, clothing was not only warm, but also dark in color. This was because dark fabrics absorbed sunlight better and heated up faster. In addition, dirt was less noticeable on dark clothing, which was especially important in conditions where clothes were rarely washed. Thus, medieval fashion was dictated not only by aesthetic preferences, but also by the harsh necessity of survival. Every layer of clothing, every element, from thick cloaks to fur linings, had its own function. People dressed to protect themselves from the constant cold, which was an integral part of their lives in stone castles. Nighttime in the castle was the coldest time of the day. Most of the hearths were extinguished, and the temperature inside dropped to critical levels. People went to bed wearing several layers of clothing. Sometimes they slept directly in their furs. The bed was the warmest place. It was usually placed away from the cold walls, and curtains around the bed created a kind of insulating dome. To keep warm, people slept together, gathering in one bed to share their warmth. In wealthy homes, servants even slept on the floor in their master's room so that their warmth would help maintain the temperature in the room. This was not only a custom, but also a necessity. For the inhabitants of the castle, sleep was not just rest, but a real test of cold. As soon as the fire in the hearth died down, the temperature dropped sharply. Without a constant source of heat, the massive stone walls and floors quickly cooled, turning into icy surfaces. People prepared for the night in advance. They wrapped themselves in several layers of clothing, put on thick woolen stockings, and even wore hats to keep their heads warm. The bed, as the main tool for survival at night, was constructed in a special way. Its frame was often made of wood so that it would not conduct cold. The bed was stuffed with straw or feathers, and several layers of woolen blankets and fur skins were laid on top. The curtains around the bed, which we mentioned earlier, were not just a decorative element. They created a mini tent that retained the heat emitted by the sleeping person's body. Thanks to this, a person did not have to heat the entire huge room, but only a small space inside the bed. Another practice was sleeping together. This applied not only to spouses, but to the whole family. Several people could sleep in one bed to share the warmth. This practice was not unusual, but rather a necessary measure. Servants slept in the same way, often lying on the floor in one room to create a stove effect. This was absolutely normal, dictated by harsh reality. The more people in one room, the warmer it was. On cold nights, people could use hot water bottles. These were clay or metal vessels that were filled with hot water or hot coals and placed in bed. This was very effective for warming bedding and warming the body. Such devices were an essential part of everyday life during the cold season. In addition to the physical cold, there was also psychological discomfort. The darkness and cold in the castle could create a feeling of isolation. The creaking of the wind in the walls and the howling in the pipes seemed to intensify the feeling of loneliness and vulnerability. Therefore, people preferred to sleep in large groups. This not only helped to keep warm, but also gave a feeling of security. Thus, sleeping in a castle was a science in itself. People used all the means available to them: layers of clothing, thick curtains, hot water bottles, and of course, each other's warmth. All these measures helped them survive the darkest and coldest hours, so that when morning came, they could once again begin the struggle for survival within the icy walls. The problem of fuel was one of the most acute. Firewood was the main source of heat, but its preparation and delivery required enormous effort. Castle administrators constantly calculated how much firewood was needed for the winter, and their reserves were a strategic resource. In addition to wood, some regions used peat or coal. Coal provided more heat and burned longer, but its extraction was difficult and dangerous, and coal itself was more expensive. Therefore, castles were most often heated with wood, and coal was used only in the coldest rooms or for special purposes. Preparing firewood was one of the most important tasks in castle life. Throughout the warm season, from early spring to late autumn, people worked hard to secure fuel for the entire winter. This required the organized work of a large number of people: woodcutters who chopped down trees, carters who transported logs, and workers who stacked them into huge wood piles. These woodpiles could reach enormous sizes and were one of the main indicators of the castle's readiness for winter. Firewood was not only a source of heat, but also a strategic reserve. In the event of a siege or a prolonged blizzard, when the delivery of new fuel was impossible, the castle could freeze completely. Therefore, the managers kept strict records of the reserves. Every woodpile was counted, and their number was carefully monitored. Firewood was stored under sheds to keep it from getting wet from rain and snow, as wet wood burned less efficiently and produced less heat. In some regions where forests were scarce, people used peat. It was extracted from bogs, dried, and used as fuel. Peat burned slowly and gave off steady heat, but it also produced a lot of smoke and had a distinctive smell. It was a good alternative to firewood, but it was not available everywhere. Its use was widespread, for example, in Scotland and Ireland, where peat bogs were abundant. Coal was another source of heat. It provided more energy than wood or peat and burned longer, but its extraction was difficult and dangerous, which made it more expensive. The coal mines of the time were primitive and posed a great danger to workers. Coal was used mainly in wealthy homes and castles, and was most often used to heat the chambers of lords and ladies, where more heat was required. Ordinary rooms continued to be heated with wood. In addition to wood, peat, and coal, people used other types of fuel. For example, in some regions, dried animal manure was used for heating. It was a cheap and accessible fuel, but it gave off an unpleasant smell and burned quickly. In castles located near rivers and lakes, they used driftwood, trees washed ashore by the water. This type of fuel was free, but collecting it required a lot of effort. Thus, the problem of fuel was a constant challenge. People were constantly looking for new sources of energy and trying to use existing ones as efficiently as possible. It was part of their daily life and a constant struggle for survival. Over time, architects began to take heating requirements into account. Castles began to be built with narrower rooms and lower ceilings, which made them easier to heat. Special furnace rooms appeared, from which heat spread throughout the house through chimneys running through the walls. Windows became smaller and were equipped with shutters that were closed at night to keep out the cold. Doors became thicker and fit more tightly to the opening. All these changes were aimed at making the castle not only an impregnable fortress, but also a place suitable for living in at any time of the year. The understanding of how to build warmer and more comfortable dwellings did not come immediately, but over time, innovations began to appear. One of the key moments was a change in the very philosophy of construction. Whereas previously a castle was exclusively a defensive structure, later it began to transform into a residence where comfort played an important role. Architects began to design castles with the needs of their inhabitants in mind, rather than just with the aim of repelling attacks. One of the most important innovations was the appearance of hollow walls and double floors. This technique allowed for the creation of an air gap, which served as additional insulation. Air, being a poor conductor of heat, retained heat inside and prevented cold from penetrating from outside. This was a very effective way to combat the icy stone. Some castles even created systems where hot air from the furnace circulated in the walls, warming them up. The size and shape of windows also underwent changes. Initially, windows were small and narrow, as they were primarily used for archery. Over time, they began to be made larger, but thick glass and heavy shutters were used, which closed tightly to keep out the cold. Glass was, of course, a very expensive material, so it was only used in the richest castles. In simpler castles, the windows remained small and were closed with thick wooden shutters or not closed at all. Doors began to be made more massive and tightly fitted to the opening. Sometimes they were covered with felt or leather to reduce drafts. Thick curtains were often hung at the entrance to the ceremonial halls, creating a vestibule and preventing the cold from entering when the door was opened. Specialized rooms for heating also appeared. Tepliaki, or caloriferium, were small rooms where a high temperature was constantly maintained. There, people could warm up before going into the cold halls. Some castles even had special systems where hot air from one furnace was fed into several rooms, allowing several rooms to be heated at once. All these architectural changes were gradual. They did not happen overnight, but accumulated over centuries. New technologies and experience were passed on from one builder to another. As a result, castles transformed from gloomy and cold fortresses into more comfortable residences. But even with these improvements, life in a castle in winter remained very harsh, and people continued to use the little tricks we mentioned earlier to survive. By the 15th and 16th centuries, castles were equipped with even more sophisticated systems. For example, castles in Germany and France began to use tiled stoves, which not only retained heat for a long time, but also looked like works of art. These stoves were a real lifesaver, as they allowed a comfortable temperature to be maintained for a long time. In some cases, they were even equipped with special channels through which hot air was supplied to adjacent rooms. This was a real revolution in the field of heating. Later during the Renaissance, large fireplaces began to appear in castles, which, although not as efficient as stoves, created an atmosphere of comfort and luxury. They had a complex system of chimneys that allowed smoke and soot to be vented outside without polluting the rooms. These new architectural solutions ultimately changed not only everyday life, but also the very appearance of castles, making them more suitable for peaceful living. Now that you know how cold it really was in medieval castles, which of these ways of keeping warm do you think was the most effective? And if you had a choice, which would you prefer? A warm and cozy room or a spacious but cold hall? Write your answer in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new videos about the most interesting historical facts. Also, if you have any ideas for future videos, share them in the comments. We are always looking for new topics and stories to tell you about. We are interested in everything from everyday life in ancient Rome to the daily life of the Vikings.